For those of you that just came in, I made some additional information to the class schedule. This will be updated on Moodle. Make sure you take a look at it. It's got more reading chapters assigned, and there will not be any class on the 19th due to a conflict that I have. So that week is going to be reading The Thermal Delight in Architecture and doing a small assignment for that. Okay, I wanted to quickly go over assignment number 2 on building envelope and heat transfer. Good job, everybody, getting your assignments in on time. Most of the responses were all very straightforward. There was a bunch of different ways to write the actual formula for conductive heat transfer, if it was with the units or with the letters. Pretty much anything was correct. Remember, again, that the opposite of a conductance is resistance, or the inverse or the reciprocal means the opposite. So it's the resistance, resistivity, which is also the R value, and can also be written as 1 over U. Whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Okay, so there's a few people were still having some problem reading the psychrometric chart. We went over that in class, I think last time. We can go over it again, perhaps today. I want to see how long the lecture takes, or if anyone wants to stay after and go over it again, or we could do it on Friday too. Just a few of you were still, it's still not clear. Everyone got humidity at 100% equals where the wet bulb equals the dry bulb temperature. And based on your responses, I think the actual dew point was 55 degrees last week. I will clarify my sentence. I was actually looking for the definition of dew point, not what the actual reading was. And keep in mind, the dew point is the temperature at which condensation occurs. And that will change based on what temperature it is. And the relative humidity. Okay, are there any questions right now regarding the assignment? Nope. Alethea? Alethea?
No, my earpiece was falling out and I was catching it. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. Yeah, that's once I dropped one and I couldn't find it for a while. All right. Jumping into passive systems. Okay. The easiest way to remember what a passive system is that it is assisting heating and cooling of our indoor environments without using any mechanical equipment. So that's no pumps, no fans, nothing mechanical, no electricity. It is purely relying on natural heat transfer systems, which are the conduction, convection, and radiation. Now, in the textbook, it has a pretty good history of passive systems dating back to the Roman times. There was a resurgence in the 70s in the US after the oil embargo occurred and gas prices skyrocketed. Before that, energy was really cheap, and so people were not paying attention to passive design in the 40s and the 50s, in the 60s. But So this is just a random example of a passive house system from the 70s, but we don't have to make it look like this anymore. We can still make it look really good. We can still use the same principles, but it doesn't have to look like a greenhouse stuck on the south side of a building. So, passive design responds to the local climate and the site conditions to maximize buildings' users and comfort and health while minimizing energy use. Doorbell, Tabitha. And Arturo. Okay. Everybody's here now. So, passive design, it varies where your climate is and what your site conditions are and the solar access of what latitude you are at. Those are all going to be factors affecting how much light you need to let in and or how much glazing area you need, how much thermal mass you need. It's really important to remember, and this is really key, and I want you guys to remember this, is that passive design is not the same thing as passive house certification. Passive House is a certification program that started in Germany. It's a philosophy on building a really strong design envelope to minimize your heating losses. It works very well in northern climates to really keep the heating load down. But it is, if people are talking about passive house, they should be referring to that certification system. If they're just talking about passive solar or passive design, that is just the design approach to adding heating or cooling to your design without any mechanical equipment. So there's a bunch of parts of the building that are the key elements for passive design. So you have your location, that's your where you're located, your latitude, your altitude, your orientation, that is how you're oriented to the sun, your building layout, your window design, daylighting strategies, what your insulation value is for your walls, and also your windows. And we'll talk about windows in a few minutes. Thermal mass is a key component of passive design. Shading is for controlling the sun, and ventilation, so to prevent overheating, and or using ventilation to help move the warm air around a building, or cool air for passive cooling. One thing to note, passive design typically requires some level of occupant participation. That could be as simple as closing curtains at night to prevent heat loss back through the glazing, or closing of vents or doors or something. But it's it's not a, you have to make your users aware of what the design intent is and that they may need to interact with the space in some way. So we're talking about building layout, daylighting, thermal mass. So don't forget about your building orientation and what surfaces are facing south. Don't forget about your fifth facade, which is your roof plane. And different shapes will perform differently with passive approaches. For example, the long skinny building that has only a very small area facing south is going to be a challenge. It might work great at this end of the building. The northern end of the building may not be so hot. There's a bunch of different types of passive systems and all sorts of different names. These are just the more common ones. There's the Trome wall, which we'll be going over. Just passive solar heating, that's a particular type of system. Passive solar cooling, that's more a combination of shade and ventilation. Passive solar cooling is where you want to prevent heat coming into your space, and or if it does, to allow it to get out efficiently and ideally without mechanical systems. Shower tower, that's a type of passive cooling. Wind chimney, solar chimney, natural ventilation. Those are all names for different approaches for natural ventilation, typically for cooling. Okay, let's start by looking at the Trome wall. This is essentially a thermal storage wall. It was named for this guy, Felix Trome, who made this popular in the 1960s. It works very well in sunny climates with a high day-night temperature swing, where it gets really hot during the day and then really cold at night. New Mexico is a good example of that type of climate. It doesn't work as well in cloudy climates or where there is a little temperature swing. It consists of a south-facing thermal mass, typically painted a dark color to help absorb more heat. It has to have an air cavity, and then it has to be covered with glazing. Those are the three main components of a Trome wall system. There are a bunch of different configurations of how you can do that, but it has to have those three parts to be considered a Trome wall system. So similar to the greenhouse effect, the glazing allows the solar radiation to enter into the air cavity that is between the thermal mass and the glazing. Okay, so once the heat gain or the direct gain is in that airspace, it's going to be absorbed by the thermal mass. A key part of the design for that thermal mass is the thickness, and you need to match your thickness to how long it's going to take that heat to transfer from the insulation space to the interior of your building. Different materials will transfer heat at different rates. So there's no set number of wall thickness to use. It's going to depend on what material you're using. Rocks, concrete, water. For example, or CMU masonry, for example, a 16-inch CMU masonry wall takes about 8 to 10 hours for the heat to reach the interior. So if you've got direct gain shining on your CMU wall that's 16 inches thick, it's going to take 8 to 10 hours for that heat to transfer all the way to the other side. There's a bunch of different configurations, like I mentioned. You can have a very simple system that's just those 3 basic components, or you can add in a ventilation component to help the system be more efficient. So if you add a vent at the top and the bottom, natural convection is going to help circulate the air. It will pull the cool air in at the bottom because cool air is lower, hot air rises. And as that air comes up in front of, in that airspace, in front of your thermal mass, it's going to warm up. And so that heat's going to rise. And then it needs to have another ventilation opening to go into the space. These openings don't have to be continuous along the entire wall. They can be at certain specific locations. But this is relying on not just conductance, but it's adding convection into the system. Now, if you have those vents, this is where a person or the inhabitant of the space needs to be actively involved, where so that you don't lose all that heat that you spend all day gaining. Those vents need to be closed at night for the heat to continue to be transferred to the interior. So it kind of looks a little hokey, maybe a little funky, and you're going, how on earth could I ever put a Trome wall in a project and make it look good? Well, you can. And I've pulled together some contemporary examples of Trome wall systems. The top 2 images go together where I'm going to get my little drawing pencil. I like the circle. So this stone wall here is the stone wall here. Now, this is super interesting application. So this is a staircase, which is what's creating that airspace, and the stone wall is the wall adjacent to the stair between it and the space. And I love these little pocket windows located throughout it. I think it's a very, very clever interpretation to add this feature into this house. Now, granted, okay, it's not going to be doing all of the heating for the entire house, but it's going to make a difference to the 2 spaces on the top and the bottom beyond the thermal wall, or the thermal mass, which is in this case a stone wall. This is another case example down here in the lower left. This is a rock wall. It looks like it's just a few, some type of lumber with a wire grid cage with just tumbled stones in between it with enough structure to hold it up. The light is on the other side. I don't have a picture of it from the other angle. So that's working for this particular space. Then the project on the lower right, this is an academic building in Kansas. I believe it was designed by BNIM. I won't swear to it though. This is the airspace in here. It is probably just over a foot wide. It is not meant to be an inhabited space, but this is their air gap. They have a south-facing curtain wall system, and then a thermal mass, probably CMU behind decorative block behind decorative stone, or I suppose this could be a poured in place wall, but that would be a very fancy one. So the cool thing I love about these contemporary examples is nobody's looking at this going, oh my God, this is like a trim wall. It's, right out of like Santa Fe, New Mexico, 1976. They become part of the architectural design. You guys have any questions so far? Okay. So that's one type of system. Next up, oops, I gotta go back to my mouse and clear the screen. Okay, moving on, passive solar heating. It's not a given name like a trim wall or particular distinctive name, I guess, but it can be applied in many different ways also, similar to a trim wall, but there are certain features, again, that need to be included. So the system is using the envelope of the building and the building materials to create this passive heating system. And again, it's relying just on the natural methods of heat transfer, of radiation, convection, and conductance. The thermal storage portion of passive solar heating is one of the building's building components. Heat the building during the heating. Okay, another key part of a passive solar heating system is you want to control what times of year you are using the direct heat gain from the sun for heating purposes, and then protect it through controlling the sun coming in during the periods of the time when you are in cooling or when you don't need heating. It is not unheard of sometimes for passive solar systems to overheat, sometimes even in the winter. The quick remedy for that is add in a little bit of ventilation through a window or something like that. So this is right out of the textbook, and this is I really like this example and this this comparison to show you what you're trying to do with your building components to create a passive solar system. The top chart, the top graph is a normally insulated building without having a high thermal mass and not paying attention to how much solar glazing area there is, or glazing area. The bottom graph shows an example of the performance when there is that large thermal mass and you are proportioning your glazing openings to work with that thermal mass to store enough energy to help balance out the temperature swings within the interior. So our target comfort zone, our thermal comfort zone, is 68 to 78. This might be a little bit more of a swing than a mechanical system would be allowed to operate. This is one of the things we were talking about in thermal comfort, that with natural systems, allowing the thermal comfort range to extend a little bit on either side, and being willing to work with it for putting on a sweater or taking off a jacket, allowing outside of the true mechanically driven, okay, we have to be 72 degrees and 55% humidity, relative humidity at all time. So with that thermal mass, what's doing is it's flattening the curve of the indoor air temperature so that the swings are not as great. It doesn't get as hot and it doesn't get as cold. And it's a slow moving system. It takes a while for that heat to transfer from your thermal mass into your space. So one thing to think about, has anyone ever spent any time in caves or spelunking or going like a tour of a gold mine? Okay, you notice how once you get inside the cave, depending on where it is in height, it can get really cold in there, or it can, but it becomes a very constant temperature. Because if you think of all of that rock, and this is not, and the cave is not letting in natural sunlight, but all of that rock is holding that constant temperature within that cave. And the temperature of the earth varies based on what your latitude is. Northern climates, like northern United States, the deep ground temperature is about 55 degrees. Here in Southern California, where we are, we actually have pretty high ground temperatures, about 68 degrees, sometimes even higher. I went to architecture school in Texas, in Austin, and there's a natural springs there, Barton Springs, that comes out of the ground, and they've made it into this public swimming facility. But it is really a river that is coming from deep underground into this pool area. And that water is always exactly, I want to say 67 degrees, but it's based on what that ground temperature is, because the ground is a large thermal mass that's keeping a constant temperature, and the water is also a thermal mass, and it's absorbing what that temperature is. Again, energy wants to transfer. Mass, volume, solids, air, everything is always trying to reach equilibrium. So at Barton Springs in Texas, the water that comes out all year round is exactly the same temperature, which feels really good when it's 110 outside. Okay. So, passive solar systems, there's a few components that make up what you need. And they won't always be called this, but they all perform the same, the aperture sometimes is just called the glazing or the opening. So that is where, that's your transparent area. That is what you're going to allow the direct gain from the sun to come through. But you want to control when that happens. So then you need your control mechanism, which is some sort of shading device that controls the time of year based on what your sun angles are, to block the sun when you don't want it, but allow it in when you do want it in the cold months. So you have your aperture and your control mechanism. You need to have your absorber that can be the same thing as your thermal mass, but it doesn't have to be. But it wants to be a dark surface. It can be, just polished concrete, or you can have a concrete floor with a dark stone on top of it. and they will work together to be your thermal mass. And then you need your distribution, and that's going to be your natural convection, that the thermal mass is going to absorb the solar heat gain and re-radiate it to the space when the air temperature is less than the temperature of the mass, which the whole point is to let that happen when you're in a colder season and that air temperature is lower. Which is why you also need to control that in the summertime, because you don't want it re-radiating to the space when you are trying to be in cooling, or if you're uncomfortable and you don't need cooling. So so 5 parts: aperture, the absorber, the thermal mass, the control mechanism, and the distribution. There's a couple of really good examples in the book too. I really like this one, where this is showing a system that has 2 different spaces that are separated, but each has their own little passive solar heating system. The one farther south has the large window with the floor being the thermal mass, and then towards the north, using a clerestory window, the thermal mass is located vertically on the wall, because that's where the sun angle is going to be hitting the surface. I think that's like just a great little diagram of how you can apply passive heating to multiple spaces, and it doesn't have to be exact. It's not limited to only south-facing rooms. And the book has some more examples on that too. There's a couple of there's a school example, and there's an office building example in, I forget where the office building is. I think it's in New Mexico somewhere. Okay. This is an important concept too, is if your thermal mass is not going to be your floor structure and you want it to be your wall structure, you need to make sure that your floor surface is light in color and has some reflectance to it, so that the light that comes in can be reflected and bounced to the thermal mass, which in this situation is a vertical wall. This design is probably set up like this because it's not a slab on grade. So this floor structure would have to be very strong to span if there was a heavy thermal mass on top of it. So the designer is using a vertical wall instead, versus here, the floor is a slab on grade and it's just a concrete floor that is absorbing the sun. Again, you want to make sure that it is dark in color, or darker in color. Okay, one important thing to note too. So when we are talking about our building envelope and insulation and solar heat gain factors and how your glazing can really affect the thermal performance of your building, that is all true. However, if you are designing a passive heating system, you don't want your glazing to be keeping your solar heating out. So you don't want to use a low E coating, and you want to allow that solar radiation to pass through your glazing so that it can be absorbed by your thermal mass. Now, this can be a little bit difficult in California with our building code requirements. As I've mentioned Title 24 a few times, that system is only looking at mechanical systems. It's not looking at passive systems. So you have to find that sweet spot, the balance between good performance for your mechanical system, but if you are relying on your passive system, you also want to let your solar heat gate in. So you gotta split that difference somewhere. But just keep in mind, the key part is no low-E coatings on the glazing or the absorber in a passive heating system. Okay, so let's look at some cool contemporary examples. Whoops, mouse again. So here are two contemporary images. Is this the same project? I don't think it is. They look very similar, but I don't believe they are the same residence. No, they're not, because this has a shade out here and a thicker horizontal. Okay, these both happen to be residential projects, but I think they're really nice, clean, simple designs. So south-facing facade with your aperture, your glazing, the roof overhang, which is your control mechanism. And notice here where that roof is angled back, the solar glazing is a lot less in aperture size, so that in the summer there will be some direct gain coming through these openings because of the overhang is not as deep, but the openings are a lot smaller. And then here, where you have the big, large openings, the overhang is a lot deeper. This example down here has two levels of overhangs. You can't see the one outside, but there's one here, and then I'm sure there's one up above, although I can't swear to it, but this overhang depth is what's calculated to keep the summer sun out, but short enough to allow the winter sun to come in. And again, we're looking at those solar sun angles. She looked at the very first week in class, and that angle is dependent on your latitude and the time of year that it is. And what you want to do is you want to look at your climate data and determine, okay, so I'm building something in Montana, but it doesn't get warm in Montana until May. Okay, so we want deeper overhangs. No, excuse me, we want shallower overhangs because we want more of the year of that sun to come in, versus here in San Diego, it can start getting warm in March or April. And so we want a deeper overhang to keep more of the sun out more of the year. Okay, so look at your climate data and your solar sun angles to calculate your depth for your overhang. And it's a pretty straightforward calculation in your building section. You draw your building section, you draw your overhang, you look up on your solar chart or use your computer program to find out what that angle is at that time of day. Good periods, good things to look at would be, say, June 21st. okay, I know I want maximum shading at June 21st, but if a little bit more sun starts coming in before and after that, that would be the maximum length that you want. If you want more shading, you would look at, say, April or May sometime to see when you want to stop that sun from coming in. Got all these lines all over the board. Okay. So 2 different interpretations, and now this is one of the examples out of the book, and I think this is a really neat project. It's a little funky looking. They're doing a lot of different things here, but one of their components for this project is passive heating for the spaces on the south side of the project. This section, this is the south side here. In this section, it's on the right-hand side. So in reading about this, I believe they had living spaces over here and then office spaces on the northern side because they wanted the warmth. They wanted more warmth in the house than in the work space. But what I think is really cool too is it's multiple. Here, I'll go to the next slide. It's really cool. It's not just one single building. So north is on the right-hand side here, but they've got three stacks of buildings here from north to south. And not only do they have the south-facing glazing on all 3 buildings, they've sloped the roof down on the north side to allow for those solar angles to hit the next building. I also like their incorporation of green roofs and terraces. And then they've got some cool sort of courtyard spaces. This is another picture here. So in this picture, I know I keep moving my mouse. We're in the picture with the circles. This is a south-facing side. And then this is the north side with that solar angle. So if you keep following it down, it looks like it may not hit the ground all the way, but anyway, we're out of perspective here. I noticed a couple other little cool tricks that they have going on here. These are solar panels up here. Oops. I thought that was a circle. These are solar panels up there. And then these are some translucent solar panels with solar cells within the glazing, but they're transparent to let in more light also. And they've got some on the north side here too. I don't know if this is just a skylight, but this could be a cool place for solar water heating. Because solar water heating, and we're not going to get into that today, but it's a lot more flexible and can absorb a lot more diffuse radiation to help heat it up. So back to our diagram. Clear eyes. The funky roof vents, we're going to talk about when we get more into ventilation, but they're allowing the hot air to come in here. They're allowing spaces for it to escape out the middle of the building well insulated roof for high performance. You can see the thickness there. And then there's some sort of ventilation going on here too. So, yeah, just, there's some aesthetics that are a little funky, but overall I think it's a very creative, contemporary project. Okay, so passive solar. The key important, besides the glazing and the thermal mass, is that control. You need to control your sun, and you don't have to do it with a straight up overhang. There are multiple different configurations that will work. We can do louvers, we can do a light shelf overhang. This is some sort of brise soleil at the window opening here, or building high. Angled sun control devices, movable sun control devices. Again, the key thing is that you want to look at your climate, look at your sun angles, and use that to determine what times of year you want your direct gain and to come in, and when you want to keep it out. A few more examples. Horizontal solar shading, vertical shading. Oh, this is definitely a user occupied method that you can use either sliding shutters or pivoting shutters for controlling time of day, from morning to evening, from east to west, or vertical fins. In our climate in particular, and actually several, morning sun is more welcome because our spaces cool down overnight. So letting more heat in during the day is desirable. But then by afternoon, when temperatures heat up and that sun is going down and you get that really sharp direct west direct gain, a vertical fin on the west side of your glazing can help prevent some of that from coming in. You can do that in patterns. This one is also a movable one. Horizontal, movable shades, again, an array or a pattern. Funky little louver that, this one looks like it's fixed, says it's an awning. So there's your imagination is the limit to design your control mechanism. As long as you understand where the sun is and when you want to have it. So passive cooling. The textbook really divides things up separately than how I think of them. I think of passive systems together. Many of the passive systems are very tightly tied to natural ventilation systems. So we're going to touch base on a couple of these today. We will continue to do so next week when we look into more specific designs for natural ventilation. So passive heating is all about letting heat in when you want it to help heat up your space. If you recall, sensible heat is dry air heat. There's no humidity factor to that. So that's what passive heating is all about. It's just getting that heat energy into your airspace. Cooling, however, because humidity is a factor of cooling, there's two, well, Okay, there's two strategies, but keep in mind that humidity is also a factor when you get into passive cooling systems. Okay, so this slide says, okay, two primary approaches to passive cooling. One is don't let the heat in at the first place. Two, if it gets in, what are you going to do about it? And how do you get it out in a timely fashion before it makes your thermal comfort out of your range of comfortability? So to keep heat from coming into the building, shading devices. We just looked at a bunch of different configurations. Creating a microclimate. This can be as simple as a courtyard. Vegetation can add to your microclimate to create a cool sink somewhere within your project. Then if heat does get in, how do you get it out? Can you do that with natural ventilation? Can you look at your prevailing winds? Where are they coming from? Can you help use those to get capture those during the hot months? Which direction do they come from? A lot of different places, the winds will move based on what time of year it is. Did we look at wind rose charts when we did climate? No, okay. That's because we're gonna go over in natural ventilation. We'll get there. You guys are looking at me like, I have no idea what she's talking about. Okay, we'll get to the data. It can be part of climate, it can be part of ventilation, but there's a lot of data out there too for almost every location about what the historical wind patterns are and what time of year they might be. San Diego is pretty darn consistent. 80% of the time, our winds come from the west. They come straight off the ocean. Then, as you all know, a few times a year, we get hit with the Santa Anas, where the wind's coming straight from the east, and it's bringing all that dry, hot air, and our humidity plummets to like 15, 20%. Fortunately, that's not 80% of the time of the year. Okay, so microclimates. Here are a few examples. I'm hoping most of you would recognize the one in the lower left. This is the, I think it's technically called the House of Hospitality, where the Prado restaurant is in Balboa Park. This picture's all lit up and dressed up for some event, but they have the fountain. A fountain or a water element is a typical feature in a courtyard that is trying to utilize that courtyard for cooling purposes. This is a shaded arbor, creating an outdoor space that's shaded. I believe the lower left picture here is the Mission at San Juan Capistrano. I'm almost positive. But that's one thing in the missions in California that the monks quickly adapted were these courtyards with the shaded walks all the way around with the vegetation in the middle to help create a cooler location within their compounds and their walls that would help them stay more comfortable, especially before air conditioning was invented. And this upper left picture, I believe this is Mexico. Again, a nice courtyard. I believe this is a water feature. I can't tell, it may not be on, but again, adding that, evaporative cooling into the cool space with the vegetation. Just adding vegetation helps make a space feel cooler. There's something, I have to look it up, but something about how the plants perspire, or well, one, they eat up oxygen or carbon dioxide, but they also give off a level of moisture. I mean, it depends on the kind of plant, but deciduous ones do. Succulents, not so much. Okay, so in our age of industry with newer technology, there's a few building materials that can be part of the building envelope that can also contribute to a passive system. One is electrochromic glass, sometimes called dynamic glass, that it uses very low voltage to change the characteristics of the glazing to make it opaque or transparent. It's not, well, it's been around at least for 20 years. Used to be really expensive. It's still not in major use yet. I don't think the cost has come down significantly, but if your design has a significant load on west face that needs a lot of glazing and it's sending your building loads skyrocketing for cooling, investing in the glazing could dramatically cut the size of your mechanical cooling system. So it could pay for itself. Doesn't look like I have any pictures of it. I don't know why. I might try and come up with a picture for Friday. Sage glass is just one product that I happen to know of that's out there. Even though it uses very low voltage, which a true believer would say, okay, that's not strictly passive, but I would argue that the little bit of electricity is not a mechanical system. It is working within the nature of the material. I would argue that you're using the building element, which has to be there for the building anyway, as part of the system. So in my book, I think it would qualify. Then there's another material, and this is fairly new. I want to say like within the last 10 years or so, starting to become more widespread, called phase change material. And it is a substance with the properties of the material inside that melt or not freeze, but become solid at different temperatures. And it can absorb heat and then re-release the heat. They're used a lot in ceilings or in roof systems. In this picture here, this guy's looks like he's putting some up into a T-bar ceiling grid. The one thing about phase change materials is when they're manufactured, you have to select the material for your target design temperature, because that's the temperature that, the stable temperature that the interior of the product is going to be. So like 72 degrees. If you want to be 72 degrees when you're heating or cooling, that's how you specify the product. If you want it colder or hotter, you have to pick the appropriate level of the capability of the material. I don't know what's inside of it. It's some poly something or other, but they say it's non-toxic. So what it does is in a ceiling or a roof structure, it will absorb heat and melt, but not let that heat come through the space. And then at nighttime, when it's cold outside and the heat is being sucked out of your building from night sky cooling, all that heat's going to go back out to the exterior. And then likewise in cooling, it releases, if it's colder inside, the heat will migrate from the material into your space instead of going, if the temperature down here is less than the design temperature, which for example could be 72. So again, keep in mind, heat is always going to migrate to try and stay at equilibrium. It's going to go from hot to cold or from cold to hot. So, and what determines how long that takes is the thickness and the property of the material, and making sure you put your materials in the right place, or your insulation in the right layer, or creating your air gap where you need it so you don't get your conductance. The book touches on phase change materials just a little bit too. In fact, I think we both have the same photo here. This lucky guy's immortalized. Okay, so that is the beginning of passive systems. Are there any questions about anything we went over today? I did upload your next assignment, which is from the material from last week on building envelope and heat transfer. So that's assignment number 3. It's up on Moodle. Is anyone having a hard time accessing the class videos? You guys are just full of vim and vigor today. Must be February. You guys are all little groundhogs. You're all staying quiet, keeping your heads down so that spring will be here soon. All right, at least I see some smiles. Okay. So we're going to continue a little bit more. We're going to look more at materials and more of the stuff from the textbook on Friday about water and concrete and stone and thicknesses and stuff like that. So round 2 coming up. If you guys don't have any questions, I will see you on Friday. If anyone wants to stay and go over the psychrometric chart, I'm more than happy to. Well, you could be tired of it by now. We will definitely be reviewing it again before the midterm. So, okay. All right, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. I'll see you guys on Friday.